Hey, Frank, how are you, pal? Good to see you. Please sit down. My name's Joe Biden. I work for Lynn Rosenthal. And good to see you again. Good to see you. I am an unadulterated fan, as I told you at my house. And hey, it's great to be with you all. And Madam Secretary, it's good to be with you. This is an example of how we want to make this a government-wide obsession to deal with this issue of violence against women. You know, we knew, and I see so many familiar faces here, we knew, and a lot of you were there then, we knew before we held our first hearing on violence against women on June 20th, 1990, that we had an epidemic on our hands. We knew it. The problem was no one wanted to believe it. The problem was we knew that this violence was extensive, and we knew we had to convince our colleagues in the House and Senate, and quite frankly, the American people, because this was the dirty little secret that everybody kept. Nobody talked about it. We knew we had to let the American people know the scope of the problem if we had any chance of making any progress. So I turned to my staff, a group of very talented women and men, mostly women at the time, and I asked, what could we do? Anybody have any ideas? And one of my staff members said, you know, we should come up with a report. And it later became known as, the report was called The Violence Against Women, A Week in the Life of America, in which we detailed not just gave a number, detailed 21,000 crimes against women that were reported in 1 week and every week in America. These stories were as powerful as they were tragic. The woman whose boyfriend was angry, I can't remember, it was because she didn't cook the meal on time or didn't wear the right skirt or whatever it was, literally held her arm out and broke her arm with a hammer. The woman whose father had beaten her with a lead pipe in the head because she disappointed him. The 15-year-old girl who was stabbed by her ex-boyfriend on the very day he was released from jail, all in one single week. And quite frankly, once the American people found out how bad it was, once we were able to communicate this notion to our colleagues, I was absolutely confident we could get something done about it. But it took a long time. The thing I'm proudest of in my career, and not that I've done all that many special things, but the thing, if I did not another thing in my life and never did another thing before, doing the Violence Against Women Act was the single most significant thing I've ever been part of in my life. And that's a fact. That's a fact. Folks, look, folks, you all are the reason why it happened. I look out there, if I start naming names, I'm going to get in real trouble. But I look out there and see so many of you who felt as passionate about this that I did. So many of you have asked me 1,000 times, is my passion born out of the fact that, like Joe Torre, my mother was beaten, or my daughter, or my wife, and thank God I didn't have that. I just had a righteous father who thought the cardinal sin any man or woman could commit was the abuse of power. Raising your hand was the ultimate abuse, a man raising his hand to a woman or a child. Ladies and gentlemen, we made a lot of progress in the last 16 years, and we're proud of that as well. We significantly, you significantly reduced acts of domestic violence. We created partnerships between federal, state, and local authorities. And we set up the National Domestic Violence Hotline, a hotline that unfortunately to this day still has to answer 22,000 calls per month. Imagine the courage it takes to make that call. Imagine the courage it takes to be in a corner. And I've gone down and listened to the calls. It goes like, is anyone there? My name is, I live. Oh my God, I'm afraid he's going to come in. Oh my God, can you help me? I love these guys who talk about courage. That takes real courage, man. And 22,000 women a month pick up the phone and ask for help. And how many thousands more never get a chance? Over the last 2 decades, we've learned an awful lot together. One of the most important things we learned is we have to do more to help victims stay safe. Once they've outed themselves, once they've come out and said, I need help, Joe, keeping them safe is hard, really hard. We need to provide legal protections for victims at the time they need it most. The most dramatic violence, the most dramatic violent murders occur shortly after the victim tries to leave. That's the most dangerous moment. That's the most, you all know this, I'm preaching to the choir here. And we need to pick up on the warning signs much better than we have thus far. There have been moments when the system could have worked better, when lives could have been saved. We know this because of what happened to a woman like Dorothy Cotter, who was 35 years old, a compassionate, beautiful woman, mother of 2 young daughters. She had suffered years of severe abuse at her husband's hands. Years. Dorothy's case had all the warning signs of homicide. Jenny Krieger of Newburyport, Massachusetts, where Dorothy sought help, wrote a note in their file when she went in. They said, quote, very lethal case was the quote on the file. But they didn't have the tools to coordinate with the police and the courts. After Dorothy's husband shot her, the Crisis Center made a commitment, not only to screen every single woman for the warning signs, but also to bring everyone together to interrupt that cycle of escalating violence. And that's how it goes. It escalates. It's kind of like drug addiction. It escalates. It never stays the same. There have been no domestic homicides in that community since that project began. We need to replace what we've been doing and replicate this kind of success. The Justice Department gets this. Today, they've released a new tool to help everyone who comes in contact with a victim to screen for these warning signs and to coordinate to keep these victims safe. They're making this a priority, and because of it, we're going to be able to literally save thousands of lives. You all know this. This is one woman at a time. This is one individual at a time. But it's not just detecting the warning signs. Research tells us that effective legal representation is the single most important factor in whether victims are able to escape this domestic violence cycle. Yet studies estimate that less than 1 in 5 low-income victims of domestic violence ever get to see a lawyer. That's why I worked so hard with Larry Tribe, not only down here, but before I got here as a lawyer, setting up, trying to get 100,000 lawyers to volunteer. But Larry Tribe's one of the great legal minds in the country. Larry Tribe's Access to Justice team was working on bringing together law firms, domestic violence agencies, and law school clinics to help represent these victims. Mitch Landrieu, the mayor of New Orleans, and the folks in Baltimore have taken this idea and they've run with it. And I want to see other communities take it on in the same way. We need to use the talents of people who really want to help, especially lawyers who want to volunteer, and there are thousands who want to volunteer. As a lawyer, I believe that the privilege of practicing law is not just a profession, but a calling to fight for justice and those who need the help the most, not just a transactional business. It should be more than that, and it is for so many. It is more than that. We just have to give them an outlet. The challenge facing victims of domestic violence is not just protection orders, but custody and family law as well. We need more resources than the government can possibly provide. You are an example of the incredible resources we have. Imagine were you not all here. No matter what the government did, no matter how much money we spent, we would have not made 1/10 the progress you've made. Today, I am literally calling on lawyers everywhere. Join us. Join us. You will never be more satisfied. You will never feel more rewarded. You will never, never, never feel better about what you've done than if you join us. I've worked with the ABA Commission on Domestic Violence to make sure they can connect the thousands of victims, and there's thousands, who need the help of a lawyer with an able lawyer who's willing to provide that help. This is about getting people together. And I know no group in the world is better connected than the outfit sitting in front of me, man. I learned the lesson of your connectivity. You think I'm joking? I'm not. You think I'm joking? I'm not. So look, improving the legal system's response is also critical in reducing rape and sexual assault. Think about this in this great nation of ours. 1.1 million women are the victims of rape each year. 1.1 million. And while these individual acts of violence may last only a moment, although some last much more, the impact on the victim can and often does last a lifetime. These women are suffering. Rape victims are 13 times more likely to attempt suicide. We owe these women. We owe these women justice. We owe these women more than a fair trial against their accuser, against the man they accuse. We owe them. And look, we can start by getting rape kits off the shelves. I spent much of my career in the United States Senate seeing to it that we financed these rape kits and we changed the way we investigate crimes and all the things we've done together. But tens of thousands of them sit on shelves. You know, there are studies showing that we did trial studies when I was in the Judiciary Committee, just only 5 years ago, showing that if we just went out and found out we got the DNA response and identification from those rape kits, Joe, we could in fact solve up to 60% of the rape crimes because a lot of these guys are sitting in prison. And you guys know better than I do. The only final closure is when a woman knows that the man who raped them has been identified and that the world knows that man raped them. And so, folks, today, the National Institute of Justice is taking this problem head on. By helping communities track and test this evidence, we're going to get rapists off the streets. Now, of course, ending violence against women is not just a problem of laws and legislation. You all know that better than I do. It's not just about the criminal justice system. It's about attitudes. It's about attitudes. Attitudes that unfortunately remain deeply embedded in our culture. As Lynn and others of you know, what really got me started in this was a poll done in Rhode Island a long time ago, showing that the response of 6th, 7th, and 8th graders to issues about how is appropriate to treat women. Well, guess what? 2009, we have another study of 6th graders. It found that 1/4 of them thought it was acceptable for boys to hit their girlfriends. Folks, this is like cutting grass. You don't ever solve it. You have to keep at it. Keep at it. And we've all learned that. We hoped differently, but it's not the way it works. In that recent study of college students, 26% thought, quote, some women who are abused secretly want to be treated that way. Say it again, 26%. 26%. College students said, some women who are abused secretly want to be treated that way. It's sick. Folks, until we change these attitudes, until we reverse the deeply held cultural assumptions, we're not going to be fulfilling the promise we made to our daughters and our granddaughters when Frank Lautenberg and I and others first got involved in dealing with domestic violence and sexual abuse. It's not about reducing it. It's about ending it. It's about ending it. And with all your help, I think we're going to get there. I know it. But there is no way we could do any of this without the leadership of the man I'm about to introduce. The biggest difference between all the work we've done in the past and now is until now, I haven't had this bully pulpit. And until now, until now, there hasn't been a president who felt this in his bones, who understands it from every aspect, who feels deeply about it. And it was probably the single most consequential communicator we have ever had. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to my real boss, President Barack Obama.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Everybody, please have a seat. Thank you so much. Let me just be clear. Biden's boss is Dr. Jill Biden. So let there be no confusion about that. I want to begin, obviously, by recognizing my vice president for the unbelievable leadership that he has shown for more than 2 decades on this issue, fighting alongside all the advocates who are here today. Great work. He started holding hearings on domestic violence back in 1990. He wrote and gathered the support to pass the Violence Against Women's Act, a law that has saved countless lives, transformed how we address these all too pervasive crimes. And as vice president, he hasn't let up. He is helping us to step up our efforts across all relevant federal agencies. So nobody feels more passionately about this than Joe, and I am grateful to him for all his leadership. We're really proud of him. I also want to thank Valerie Jarrett, my senior advisor and chair of our Council on Women and Girls. Valerie has helped to ensure that the issues that we're talking about today, the concerns of women and girls, are addressed at the highest levels of our government. I want to acknowledge Lynn Rosenthal, the first ever advisor at the White House. So we're proud of Lynn. I guess you know her. She's been calling you up a little bit. But she's doing great work helping to advise us on these issues. I want to thank Judge Susan Carbon, the director of the Office on Violence Against Women at the Department of Justice. We're proud of what we're doing here. I want to thank my Secretary for Health and Human Services, Secretary Sebelius, who is helping to coordinate our efforts. And finally, I want to thank everybody who is here today for the work that you're doing to stop domestic violence and to help its survivors. You've got champions like Senator Frank Lautenberg and Congresswoman Donna Edwards, who've done extraordinary work in Congress. You've got leaders like Mayor Mitch Landrieu of New Orleans, and I think you already heard about some of the interesting work that they're doing down in that city. There's so many organizations that are represented here today. We are very proud of you and what you do. I'm thrilled to see Joe Torre, who's here, who understands this issue personally and deeply. And for him to lend his name to this is extraordinarily important. We hope that the Dodgers do better next year. My White Sox aren't doing so hot either. So, as you all know, domestic violence was for far too long seen as a lesser offense. As Valerie said, it was frequently treated like a private matter. Victims were often sent home from the hospital without intervention. Children were left to suffer in silence. And as a consequence, abuse could go on for years. In many cases, this violence would only end with the death of a woman or a child. And we've come an incredibly long way since that time. We have changed laws. We've made progress in changing the way people think about domestic abuse. As Joe pointed out, we've reduced the incidence of domestic violence. And we've done so in no small part because of the advocacy of your organizations and the willingness of victims to tell their own stories even when it's difficult. And if there's one group that I want to thank, am grateful for, it's people who are willing to tell their stories, because it's hard. It's hard stuff. You know, when Joe Torre stands up and talks about growing up in an abusive household, about being afraid to come home when he saw his dad's car parked in the front of the house and finding a refuge in baseball, that connects in a way that no speech by a politician can connect. You know, as a consequence, he started Safe at Home, a foundation for children going through what he went through, and it's helping kids all across the country. We're joined by Lori Stone and Ruth Glenn, both of whom were victims of years of violent abuse in their marriages. And they're sharing their stories in the hope that nobody else has to experience the pain and fear that they lived with every day. You know, those stories remind us of how cruel, how menacing domestic violence can be, because it happens at home, the place where you should feel safe, because the abuse comes at the hands of the people who are supposed to love you and trust you, because escaping domestic violence is not only associated with a great deal of fear, but also incredible financial and legal challenges that often leave victims of abuse feeling trapped. That's what we have to change. And I say that not only as a president, but as a son, as a husband, as the father of 2 daughters. Now, we've made a great deal of progress in recent years, but everybody in this room understands that our work is not yet finished. Not when there's more we can do to help folks looking to restart their lives and achieve financial independence. Not when there's more to do to ensure that the victims of abuse have access to legal protection. Not when children are trapped in abusive homes, especially when we know the lingering damage and despair that this can cause in a child's life. Not when 1 in every 4 women experiences domestic violence, and 1 in 6 women are sexually assaulted at some point in their lives. It's not acceptable. And I know that Valerie and Joe spoke about some of our efforts in detail, but I just want to highlight a few key parts of what is a new coordinated effort to protect victims and break the cycle of abuse. We're helping the victims of violence to overcome the financial barriers they often face getting back on their feet. And Lori's experience serves as an example. Lori had not only had suffered abuse at the hands of her husband physically, he also destroyed their credit. And she had to spend her limited savings on legal representation to keep custody of her children. So we're going to start taking steps to connect survivors with jobs, to help them save, to make it easier for them to rebuild their credit, to make sure that no one has to choose between a violent home and no home at all. And Secretary Donovan at the Department of Housing and Urban Development is releasing new rules today to prevent the victims of domestic violence from being evicted or denied assisted housing because a crime was committed against them. It's not right. We're going to put a stop to it. We're also doing more to help the victims of domestic violence access legal services and protections. So today, the Justice Department is releasing new tools and best practices to judges, to advocates, to law enforcement to help ensure that protective orders are issued and enforced. And the Vice President and the Justice Department are launching a new effort to help victims of domestic abuse find lawyers to represent them pro bono. You heard Joe talk about that. That's critical. That's important. As the advocates in this room can attest, when a victim of abuse leaves a violent relationship, it's often a particularly vulnerable time. I know that's when Ruth Glenn was viciously attacked by her husband, and there are many stories like this, too many stories. But we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can for victims in this critical period to ensure that folks who are seeking help and protection get that help and get that protection. That's our responsibility. So these are just a few of the steps that we're taking, but the bottom line is this: nobody in America should live in fear because they are unsafe in their own home. No adult, no child, and no one who is the victim of abuse should ever feel that they have no way to get out. We need to make sure every victim of domestic violence knows that they are not alone, that there are resources available to them in their moment of greatest need. And as a society, we need to ensure that if a victim of abuse reaches out for help, we are there to lend a hand. Now, this is not just the job of government. It's a job for all of us. So I want to thank all of you for the work that you do in your respective communities. And I want you to know that this administration is going to stand with you each and every step of the way. So congratulations on your great work. We've got more work to do, and I couldn't be prouder to be part of this effort. Thank you very much, everybody.